Battlefield 6 is here, but is it really Battlefield? This question is actually more important than you might think, and today I wanted to talk about the cost of redefining this series. And the open beta has gotten a lot of praise recently, but I've actually also seen a lot of criticism which has been met with a ton of hostility. And I think many people consider themselves veterans because they played Battlefield 3 and Battlefield 4, but the series actually started long before that, and those games set the groundwork for the games that took place after. And I actually started from the very beginning with Battlefield 1942. My favorite is actually Battlefield 2 with a special shout out to Battlefield 2142, and that's 2142, not 2042. And if you played those games back in the day, I'm sure you loved them as much as I did, but I think to understand why some players don't like where Battlefield 6 is headed, or why something just feels off, I think we have to go back to really exploring that initial question, that essential question, which is, what is Battlefield? And so I wanted to start off and go back to Battlefield, and in particular the older Battlefield games. And I'm talking like Battlefield 1942, Battlefield 2, Battlefield Vietnam, all these games. And even if you didn't play them, it's important to kind of understand things, because I think that with the early Battlefield games, which I kind of define as anything before Battlefield 3, basically, and maybe Battlefield Bad Company. I mean, I think those were kind of the two pivot points from the series, but anything before Bad Company or Battlefield 3, there was basically this idea of creating the Battlefield FPS, where it was just kind of this simulation of a battlefield, right? A lot of FPS games at the time were kind of not like this. It was like a Counter-Strike or something like that. And Battlefield tried to simulate what it was like to be on a battlefield, but it wasn't a hyper-realistic simulator. And so it was kind of this in between a kind of more Twitch-based first-person shooter and something very slow and methodical. And I think that that's where Battlefield's always like kind of had its core identity, where it's trying to be a little bit more realistic, a little bit slower, a little bit more grounded than kind of this Twitch-based, fast-paced first-person shooter, but not a hyper-realistic simulator like Arma or Squad or something like that, but a little bit slower pace than your Call of Duties, your Quakes, stuff like that. And so, this was very novel at the time, playing the early Battlefield games like 1942 or Battlefield 2, where it had this identity that you were kind of simulating the battle. You were simulating this overarching battle with all these vehicles. There were air vehicles, there was land vehicles, there was infantry combat, but you were kind of working together as a team. And I think that a lot of people, they talk about team elements with the Battlefield games, and I do think that a lot of that has been missing in the newer Battlefield games, but at the same time too, there's a team element to it, but it's not like hyper team oriented. It's not like a Squad. If you play some of these very tactical first person shooters like Squad or Arma, it's not quite like that, but there's a level of a team element to things compared to, say, just your typical Call of Duty. And I think a lot of people like that idea. And of course, it was also a lot slower paced, and it wasn't really hyper realistic like a Squad or Arma, but it was a little bit more than just kind of this arcade shooter. And that slower paced element and that team element helped to build the believability in the world of this battlefield that you were playing. And to some extent, there was this kind of element of strategy to things, because in the game, it wasn't just kind of these meat corridors, these hallways where kind of have three sections of the map and people are just kind of running down them and they're just dying very quickly, and they just kind of respawn, get 2 or 3 kills, and then they move on. And I think some people have complained about that in the Battlefield 6 open beta, but you kind of see like more of this element of strategy to things. And so especially too, if you look at just some of the older maps, there was more room to kind of maneuver. There was a lot more of playing an objective. There was more of maneuver and creating kind of a more open-ended battle. And even some of these kind of more intense maps that I really do love, there was an element of the battle changing pace. There was a changing pace with each kind of dynamic in the battlefield, and there was different ways to play it. Even though the teamwork was very loose, in a lot of ways, it was more slower paced, methodical, and there was strategy elements to it. So, for example, a map that I love from Battlefield 2, Strike at Karkand, an awesome map. It's a very intense map. It's got a lot less, it's a lot more tighter quarters than other maps in the game. But at the same time, too, you actually see a lot of things that added strategy to the game, and they also added a level of changing of pace between the map. So at the very beginning, you have this very intense battle from the countryside into the city. And even within the city, you had all these different kind of points that you go down. You go to the right side of the map and try to kind of get some angles on people. You could go straight into the city on the right side, or you can go down the left side. You could go straight down the road with the tank, or what some people would do is they go to the far left and try to play on that side. Or some people would actually just rush with the vehicles to the back left point of the map. And so if they could capture that point, it adds this new front that exists within the battle. So some players now are moving north. and northwest to counteract that. And then that changes the amount of players that are in the bottom section. And so it changes this dynamic. You had some people that would play a special forces class and they would go to the far right. They would try to run past everyone to blow up the enemy commander's artillery, or even capture points further down, to kind of change that flow, to try to get out of this kind of corridor and open up positions for your team. And like I said, this was a very intense map, kind of closer to like the Metro map, I guess, in Battlefield 3 and some of these kind of more intense maps. But you had options to kind of maneuver. And what would happen too in a lot of these situations is you'd have a squad and you would kind of maybe group up with your squad. So one person would basically go after the artillery in the far right side of the map, and you would join them. And so it would be 3 or 4 of you kind of together on this kind of special forces mission to kind of take out the enemy artillery. Or you would get in the vehicle with some of your squad mates to capture that far top left point. And so you'd be kind of grouped together in this kind of battle. And because commander mode was also introduced in Battlefield 2, which was an awesome thing, I really wish they would have brought that back. It added a level of teamwork if you were the commander player. So you would possibly give artillery strikes to kind of help people to capture points. You would get supply drops for people, or UAVs to help people to see the enemy. There was a dynamic of teamwork with the commander mode and then also working with the squads. And in a lot of ways, you were almost encouraged to play with those squads because of the supply drops, because of UAVs or the radar and stuff like that. And so there was an element of teamwork to things, this more of an element of strategy to things that really helped the core gameplay. And it was a lot slower, more methodical paced. I think you also saw this actually in Battlefield 1942, because at the same time too, there was maps like Battle of Midway, Battle of Guadalcanal, these kind of sea maps where you had these ships, and it was a ton of fun. There was the aircraft carriers and like the battleships and the submarines, and you would actually have some people pilot those, but then you could also get on the guns, and so you're almost kind of working as a unit on the ship, trying to take out enemy forces on land or other enemy ships. You had people that tried to repair the ship, and so you had people getting on and getting the transport boats to try to get to a certain section in the island. There was more of this teamwork element, and it wasn't teamwork, I think, in how people strictly think about it, like a squad, Arma, something like that. But there's a kind of a more sense of teamwork and playing the objective in these kind of older games, whether it was 2142, 1942, 2, stuff like that, than in kind of the newer games, I think. And the thing too is that a lot of this core gameplay was so fun. I mean, there was no real ranks back in the day. I mean, there was in Battlefield 2 and 2142, but it was so primitive compared to the progression systems that you have now. And it just speaks to how good the gameplay was. So here's like a good test. If you could play the game with no sense of progression, no unlocks, none of that stuff, and you're still having fun and you still want to play it, that's a good game. That has great gameplay. If you don't need any form of progression systems, you don't need any microtransactions, cosmetics, and just play it, that is a game with awesome gameplay. Or if it's very minimal progression, that is a game with awesome gameplay. And so you saw that with Battlefield Vietnam, Battlefield 2, Battlefield 2142, even though they had progression systems, at least those two did, there was less of this idea of the hero. And I think you see that a lot now with streamers and personalities and people trying to get high KD ratios. I mean, there was this hero dynamic in the older Battlefield games, but I think a lot of times it was more limited to people in vehicles. Like you really saw that happen more with people that were really good at helicopters or jets. Like there was people that were really, really good, and those people could influence the battle. But at the same time too, people would notice the guy that was really good at the jet and they would try to work together to try to take out that jet. There was just such fun to that, right? There was less of this hero dynamic. Everyone was kind of working together as a team because you weren't like a super soldier streamer. There were people that were really good, but it wasn't the same. Your power level, in a way, your power level was limited in a way. And I think that was poor to this kind of older, slower paced Battlefield that had an element of teamwork, an element of strategy. Like I said, it's nothing too crazy, but people would talk and chat about, oh, let's capture this far left point so we can get out of the fields that we're in where we're pinned down by the artillery. And you would get in a vehicle with a bunch of people and try to open up the direction to somewhere. It's hard to say whether that will change in the Battlefield 6 open beta, just because there's a lot of people just kind of running and playing kind of more like a Call of Duty style. But it's just something that is core to the essence of this kind of old Battlefield. And another thing too, a lot of people they complain that there's no server browsers, and a lot of people, I think, just they brush aside this is like an old player thing. And server browsers were so good. I mean, there were so many benefits to server browsers where when you played on servers, I think that there's no skill-based matchmaking. So essentially when you went to a server, there was people that were really good, there was people that were really bad. You saw people that were there all the time. And so there was none of this kind of psychology there to try to fit you with people that were your exact skill level. You had to get good. I mean, if there was someone that was really good with a jet and you wanted to use a jet, you had to get good to beat that person with the jet or play someone that was more of an equivalent of your level. And I think that what that did is it made the battlefield a lot more dynamic. And it also kind of encouraged you to kind of get good. And I think in a way, it just made things a lot more fun than this kind of hyper skill-based matchmaking and kind of competitiveness that you see today. And I think too, like while there was cheating back in the day, I think that there was less of an emphasis on this. And there's a lot of reasons why there's more cheating today. But I think that also when you had people that were admins, they could identify a cheater and then they could just kick them. And so, there was less of this problem because you're not just relying on this auto kind of system in the back to get rid of a cheater. And so there was also this sense of community with these servers where, it was like a strike of Karkan 24/7. And I think that something like that is lost nowadays, where you're kind of just queued into these matches and you kind of don't know if you're being influenced from skill-based matchmaking or some sort of engagement metric. And I think that a lot of players miss that. They miss some of these elements that I'm talking about. With this core like Battlefield, this old school dynamic, which is what I love about Battlefield. I love this slower paced dynamic, more semi-teamwork element, this kind of simulation of the battlefield. You started to see a shift with the game. And I think that the first shift was with Bad Company. And well, actually, maybe you could also argue it's Battlefield 2 Modern Combat, but regardless, both of these games kind of added this single player element to things, and they were also developed for the console markets for the first time. And so that kind of changed things up a little bit versus Battlefield being a PC exclusive game series before that. And then it had these lower player counts and multiplayer. And I remember seeing that at the time and thinking, I don't like this because there's less players. There's no 64 player maps. Like, I don't understand this. And so I think you saw with the company wanting to kind of get more broader sales, right? To appeal to that console market, to get even more players onto the game. And of course, in the late 2000s too, you saw the rise of Call of Duty with Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare, a huge game that just brought a huge amount of people into Call of Duty. And then especially after that with Black Ops and stuff like that. And so then you saw this kind of second inflection point, which was Battlefield 3, taking Battlefield into the next realm, right? The kind of next generation with these just amazing graphics, this amazing destruction and simulation. And it really, and Bad Company did a little bit of this, but it's just, that was the inflection point where you had this kind of more of the more modern graphics and simulation into the Battlefield series. And then of course you had a kind of a campaign mode, and that was very different. And I've actually never really associated Battlefield with story campaigns at all. I know some people do, but I just, to me, it was always the multiplayer. So that's fine if people like that, but that's where there's this inflection point. And so a lot of players are starting there, these kind of veterans, starting at this Battlefield 3, Battlefield 4 level, which, like I said, there's this entire group of games before that is establishing what Battlefield is. And what Battlefield is in that series is, like I said, something that's a lot slower pace. It's simulating the battle. It's not about the hero. There's a level of teamwork to it. There's a level of strategy to it, but nothing too intense, nothing too hyper realistic, but not gamified. There's just a little bit of a difference. And so with Battlefield 3 and Battlefield 4, I think you kind of kept the spirit. It did change a little bit because, in Battlefield 2, there was more classes. I think it added some more dynamicism to the game, and they kind of shrunk everything down to 4 classes. And of course, you saw that emphasis on graphics, on these amazing sound effects, and it was really cool. I mean, I remember seeing the Battlefield 3 trailer at the time, and it was really, really awesome. It was a really cool trailer. It was totally breathtaking at the time. And I think that Battlefield 3 and 4 still kind of held that spirit. It started adding these progression systems, and so these were all, I think, in a lot of ways, really good changes. And they kind of finally culminated, I think, into Battlefield 4, which a lot of players now, that's what they play. It's probably the last remnant of this kind of older Battlefield that I'm talking about. I mean, I think that really that older Battlefield is probably really encompassed by Battlefield 2. But if you don't want to say Battlefield 2, I would say it's probably Battlefield 3 or 4. But Battlefield 4 is the most relevant nowadays, so that's what you would probably say. And so after Battlefield 4, I think that what happened was Call of Duty was just so huge. So, Battlefield did really great with Battlefield 3 and 4, but relative to Call of Duty, the sales were just not the same. And I think that they thought, how do we get to the Call of Duty level? Because Battlefield was very successful. I mean, it was very popular. It did great sales. People loved the games, and like I said, there was some changes from like Battlefield 2 to 3 and 4, which some people didn't like, but I'd say generally speaking, people generally kind of liked it. But I think that the company is like, how do we catch up to Call of Duty? And so you started to see things change a little bit with Battlefield 1. And I know a lot of people love Battlefield 1, but I think there was some slight changes. But really, after Battlefield 1 is this other inflection point with Battlefield 5, Battlefield 2042. I mean, you kind of saw that with the spinoff Hardline as well, but there was kind of this push to try to, I think, be more like Call of Duty in a way. where you saw kind of an abandonment of some of the realism with some of the microtransactions. You saw things like going away from a lot of the core identity of Battlefield, like with operators instead of classes. I think that there was a lot faster pace. There was less emphasis on teamwork, stuff like that, that kind of changed the identity of Battlefield, and also just in a lot of ways the quality of the game into this kind of newer wave. And then finally you kind of come to Battlefield 6, which at the surface, it seems kind of like Battlefield 3 and 4, but in a way it's a little bit different. And there's so many things too that when you see Battlefield 6 and you probably look at the broader strategy going on, it's a little unclear, because while it kind of goes back to that more groundedness of Battlefield 3 and 4, goes to this something that resembles something more close to that, I think in a lot of ways you see something that doesn't quite resemble the older Battlefields that I just talked about. So I think that the game is very fast-paced. It really does feel like it feels like this weird hybrid between Call of Duty and Battlefield. It's very fast-paced, could be the open beta where it just seems like people are very much playing like Call of Duty. There is obviously this streamer dynamic which affects things, but there's just some feelings where it almost has these elements from Call of Duty. And you have to ask yourself, why is that? And I think it's because, once again, I think it's trying to become this next big thing, and especially this huge thing from a revenue and profitability perspective. And I think there's so many dynamics that you see that are kind of going towards this. I mean, so if you look at Battlefield 6, and so many things have changed in gaming from when I talked about with Battlefield 1942, Battlefield 2, you're playing these games, there's no progression system or very limited progression systems. You have these streamers, right? And streamers are a huge component in gaming now, and they play the hero dynamic in a lot of ways. So they're playing the hero, and what does that mean? They want to have these viral moments. They want to have these high KD ratios, these big games. They want people to watch them. They want it to be entertaining. It's this fast-paced motion. It's almost like this mobile sniper where in the past, like it wasn't really like a mobile sniper. It was, you're playing prone, you're scouting things out. It's a lot more slower and methodical. Now it's more of like this Twitch-based gameplay, more like Call of Duty, because it's almost supporting this streamer dynamic. It's almost supporting this idea of the hero. And a lot of, even if you're not a streamer, I think a lot of people want to play like that. They want to play faster pace. You see a lot of this with this more faster paced gameplay, something resembling more like Call of Duty. You see this further supported by streamers. And when you look at that preview event and they show off the gameplay and they show off all the streamers, I mean, once again, it goes back to what I was saying. Okay, so it's an appeal to streamers. Well, what do streamers want? Streamers want the things I said, these fast-paced moments, viral moments, things like that. And so that's very antithetical to the older Battlefield, and even in a lot of ways, Battlefield 3 and 4. And I understand that there are influencers and streamers in kind of slower paced games. And so, you have games where people are slower, more methodical, but they're not the same streamers. They're not these streamers that are ultra popular. They're not streamers that are huge. And so I think that slower gameplay, that team gameplay, it's a lot harder to kind of have that hero mindset with streamers. It's a lot harder to have that hero mindset with what some people want out of first-person shooters. And so in a way that is a directional shift within Battlefield. And I think that you also see this kind of, like I said, it's more solo oriented. There's more of a solo oriented play to the game. And there's less of this teamwork dynamic. There's less of this kind of, at least from the open beta, it seems, there seems to be this less of the strategic dynamic. It just seems very reminiscent of Call of Duty in so many ways. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, depending on who you are. But I think that a lot of people have kind of moved to Battlefield because Call of Duty has disappointed them in so many ways, whether it's cheating or microtransactions or the overall quality or staleness of the game. And so I think they're looking for that Call of Duty experience. And Call of Duty has obviously sold really well. And so I think there has been adoption of some of these mechanics and ideas. Now, is that a bad thing? Not necessarily, depending on who you are, but I mean, for a lot of Battlefield players, it's like not what they want. And so some of the positive hype you see is partly because of people's annoyance with Call of Duty in a way. But at the same time too, I think that you have changing dynamics within gaming and how people treat first-person shooters. And I think also within, especially the FPS genre in general, you see more of an acceptance of microtransactions. And so this microtransactions, I think, basically change the dynamic in a lot of ways. And so basically you have a different audience. It's an audience that cares less about immersion and things like that. And obviously we don't have any crazy microtransactions or anything like that at the moment. But when you look at the gameplay, in a lot of ways, it's very fast paced. I mean, even with something like the snipers and stuff, it's just very fast paced, and it just feels very different than the older Battlefield games, at least the ones that I'm talking about. And I think that, once again, there seems to be a strategy towards more of a mass appealable market. So what is a mass appealable market? Well, it's like those things like a story campaign. It's a battle royale mode. And obviously some of the dynamics that I talked about, with the older Battlefield games, I mean, those were PC games, right? You had to get on PC and play Battlefield 2 or 2142. And so I think that things like server browsers are not mass appealable. I think when you have dynamics where you have complicated strategies of, hey, let's get a group of people and go over here to the far right or left, it's less mass appealable. It adds more complexity. There's when things are slower paced and you have to kind of strategize about getting into a good position to kind of take out the enemy team, that's not fast paced. I want to just get into the action, right? It's less mass appealable in a way. And I think that's the thing too about it all, right? When I looked at what Battlefield used to be, Battlefield was kind of something that was a little bit more slower paced. It was very methodical. It was a little bit more team oriented. It was this cross section between kind of the arcade shooter and this hyper realistic simulator. It was something in between that. And I think that that's what a lot of people love about Battlefield. They don't want to play Arma. They don't want to play Squad, but they also don't want to play Call of Duty. They want to play a Battlefield simulator where it's not hyper realistic. They can get into a jet and they're not playing Microsoft Flight Simulator. But that's that niche that Battlefield had. But I think that the thing is that only appeals to so many people, but that's okay. In my opinion, that's okay. Because Battlefield 3 and Battlefield 4 did really well. And the earlier Battlefield games obviously did well because they led to more sequels and stuff like that. But I think that there has been this push to say, how do we get to that Call of Duty level? How do we get to that next level? And I think the only way to do that is to make it more mass appealable. And that's things like faster paced gameplay, changing dynamics, especially team-oriented dynamics, stuff like that. And I think that some of those feelings that you have possibly where you're like, I just don't like Battlefield 6, something feels off, it feels like Call of Duty, things like that, I think is somewhat of an influence of those broader dynamics, which makes total sense. I mean, if you have this huge project and you want to try to compete with Call of Duty, you want to try to be this next big thing, I think that there's a limit to playing in that space between the arcade shooter and the hyper-realistic Arma simulator, right? You can be like Arma and Squad and be hyper-realistic and everything like that, but there's only so many people that want to play that. And there's only so many people that want to play the next level and the next level and the prior level. So I think that is the problem, fundamentally, is there is this kind of identity crisis in a lot of ways of what Battlefield is. And so, to me, and I think a lot of older Battlefield players, what is Battlefield? Battlefield is a slower, methodical game. It's a little bit team-oriented. There's a degree of strategy, and you feel immersed in that world of playing in this general battle, this overall arcing battle where you're immersed into it. And I think it's just kind of been shifting towards something a little bit more akin to a hero dynamic, a little bit faster pace, a little bit more in the direction of Call of Duty versus what original Battlefield is. And I think that's why a lot of people kind of feel off about it. And the question is, can they actually achieve the results they want by trying to shift towards Call of Duty? I think that in some ways they can, but I think it's a tough thing to do. I think it's a tough thing to kind of take your identity and to change it into something else, and Call of Duty is still just a big monster despite all of its problems. It's a big game, it's very popular. And so I don't know. I think that it's a tough thing to do. I really wish that a lot of video games, and in particular Battlefield, would just kind of understand what it is, what its identity is, and that's what it is. And I really wish that you kind of kept that dynamic and that trueness to whatever Battlefield is, which I think is something that in its core formula with which I described is probably always going to be a little bit less popular than a Call of Duty. And you kind of see this with the history of the Battlefield series. I just think that there's something fundamental about the relative popularity of certain things. It's true with like almost all video games. Some video games are very mass appealable. Other video games, they're kind of more specialized. They're kind of more complicated. They're not for everyone. And I really wish Battlefield would try to stick to that core identity. But I think what you're seeing here is that dynamic of trying to be a little bit different, a little bit more approachable. And I could be wrong about this, but it just seems like that seems to be the core essence of why Battlefield 6 feels off for a lot of people, why they don't like it, or where there's a lot of concern, I think, coming from with Battlefield, and what actually kind of might happen as time goes on and Battlefield 6 is eventually released and things play out. Of course, I could be wrong about that, but I think that core idea is probably what's driving that feeling. And of course, there's always the nuanced elements that are driving that, like the faster paced gameplay or the corridors and stuff like that, which I think is kind of getting down to the nitty gritty of things. But that is the core essence of what Battlefield is, at least the older essence, is that slower paced gameplay. What will happen with Battlefield? We'll have to wait and see. But I think that this idea is the kind of the central focal point that people are wondering what's going to happen when the game is released and what will Battlefield do in the future.